Frost coated the windows of Oakhaven as neighbors watched Harlan Mercer drag his rusted cedar through a blinding January blizzard. Everyone laughed, writing him off as a desperate lunatic, burying his absolute last dime in a frozen grave. 90 days later, the laughter abruptly stopped. Harlan cashed a $4 million check. The wind howling off the Dakota Plains in the winter of 1998 was cold enough to snap a crowbar. In the farming community of Oakhaven, fields were supposed to be dead by November, buried under 2 feet of hard-packed ice and snow, waiting for the spring thaw. Farmers spent January inside nursing hot coffee, repairing machinery, and praying to the banks for an extension on their seasonal loans. Harlan Mercer didn't have the luxury of waiting for spring. Sitting in the cramped, wood-paneled office of Midland Trust, Harlan stared at the foreclosure notice sliding across the desk. The bank manager, Bradley Higgins, wouldn't even meet his eye. Bradley had known Harlan since high school. They had played football together. But business was business, and Harlan owed $420,000. 3 consecutive years of summer drought had decimated his corn yields, and the Mercer family farm, 300 acres of prime, albeit currently frozen topsoil that had been in his family for 4 generations, was officially on the chopping block. "I'm sorry," Harlan schluchzte. Bradley said, tapping a gold pen against the mahogany desk. "We can't extend the line of credit. The board has already made the decision. You have until April 1st to clear the debt, or the bank seizes the deed." April 1st. 90 days. It was a death sentence. Harlan walked out of the bank and into the biting cold, pulling his worn Carhartt jacket tight around his neck. As he climbed into his beat-up Ford F-15, he saw a brand-new Cadillac Escalade roll down Main Street. Behind the wheel was Garrett Fowler. Fowler was the corporate agricultural titan of Oakhaven. While families like the Mercers struggled, Fowler bought up their bankrupt farms for pennies on the dollar, expanding his empire to over 5,000 acres. Fowler rolled down his window, a smug grin plastered across his face. Cold day to be out begging Harlan. Fowler called out his breath, pluming in the freezing air. "I heard about the Midland meeting. Tell you what, I'll give you $200,000 for the land right now. You can pay off half your debt and avoid bankruptcy. I'll even let you keep the farmhouse." Harlan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "The land isn't for sale, Garrett," Fowler chuckled, rolling his window up. "It will be by spring. See you at the auction." Harlan drove home to his wife, Abigail, who was sitting at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea. She saw the look on his face and knew immediately. The bank had said no. But Harlan wasn't ready to surrender. He walked into his study, locked the door, and pulled out a lockbox. Inside was a desperate gamble, a contact he had made 3 years prior at an agricultural convention in Chicago. The contact was Dr. Elias Gallagher, a brilliant but disgraced botanist who had been exiled from corporate agriculture for his radical genetic experiments. Gallagher had developed a proprietary, highly experimental strain of Crocus sativus saffron. But this wasn't just any saffron. Gallagher had spliced the delicate Mediterranean bulb with the genetic markers of alpine tundra flora. It was an extreme cold hybrid designed to germinate entirely under a blanket of snow, utilizing the insulating properties of the ice to protect the delicate stigmas before exploding into bloom at the exact moment of the first spring thaw. Saffron was the most expensive spice in the world, selling for over $5,000 a pound. If Harlan could yield even a fraction of what Gallagher promised, he wouldn't just pay off the bank, he would be rich. But there was a catch. The bulbs had to be planted in the dead of winter. The soil had to be at exactly freezing temperature, and the bulbs required immediate coverage by heavy snow to trigger their dormancy cycle. Harlan had drained the last $40,000 of his savings money, meant for Abigail's medical bills and their emergency fund, to secretly import 100,000 of Gallagher's hybrid bulbs. They were sitting in his barn right now, packed in dry peat moss. When Harlan told Abigail his plan that night, the silence in the kitchen was heavier than the snow falling outside. "You want to plant in the snow, Harlan?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling. "In January the ground is like concrete. You'll destroy the tractor, you'll freeze to death, and everyone in town will think you've lost your mind." "Let them think I'm crazy," Harlan replied, his eyes burning with a desperate fire. "Abby, if we do nothing, we lose the farm. If we fail, we lose the farm. But if this works, if Gallagher is right, we buy our life back." The next morning, the temperature plummeted to 14 degrees below zero. A historic blizzard was moving in from the north. The local radio station was warning everyone to stay indoors. Instead, Harlan fired up his John Deere 4440. Because the ground was frozen, solid standard tilling was impossible. Harlan had spent the last 2 weeks secretly modifying a heavy-duty subsoiler, attaching diamond-tipped ripper shanks meant for mining operations just to tear through the frost line. When Harlan drove the tractor out into the blinding white field, the roar of the engine echoed across the valley. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. Within an hour, trucks began pulling up to the edge of the Mercer property. They stood by the fence line, bundled in heavy coats, watching in utter disbelief as Harlan Mercer dragged the ripper through the ice. The metal shrieked against the frozen earth, sending shards of ice and frozen dirt flying into the air like shrapnel. "He's finally snapped," mumbled Peter Sullivan, the editor of the Oakhaven Gazette. The stress broke his brain. Garrett Fowler arrived 30 minutes later, laughing so hard he had to lean against the hood of his truck. "Look at him. He's planting snow." Somebody called the sheriff before he kills himself, but Harlan couldn't hear them over the deafening roar of the engine and the howling wind. It was brutal, agonizing work. The tractor cab had no heat, and the wind chill was 30 below. Harlan's hands were blistered, his lips cracked and bleeding. Every hour the ripper blades would jam with ice, forcing him to climb out into the blinding snowstorm and hack at the frozen machinery with an iron crowbar. For 3 days and 3 nights, Harlan didn't sleep. He worked under the harsh glare of halogen work lights, the tractor, a lone, stubborn beacon in a sea of raging white. He dropped the 100,000 bulbs into the jagged trenches he had carved into the ice, moving purely on adrenaline and black coffee brought out to him by Abigail, who trudged through the drifts with tears frozen on her cheeks. By the dawn of the 4th day, the storm broke. Harlan shut off the tractor. His fuel tank was empty. His body was completely shattered. The field looked like a war zone of torn ice and jagged frozen dirt quickly being buried again by the settling snow. He stumbled into the farmhouse, collapsed onto the mudroom floor, and slept for 24 hours straight. When he finally woke up, the local paper was already on the kitchen table. The headline read, "The Mercer Mud Pie. Local farmer loses mind in blizzard." Harlan pushed the paper aside. Now there was nothing left to do but wait. February in Oakhaven was a month of brutal psychological torture. The snow sat thick and heavy over the Mercer fields, an impenetrable white blanket hiding the million-dollar gamble beneath. Every day, Harlan would walk out to the edge of the field holding a cup of coffee, just staring at the snow. The mockery in town hadn't died down. If anything, it had grown vicious. At the local diner, people stopped talking when Harlan walked in. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They whispered about how Midland Trust was already drafting the auction papers. Garrett Fowler, however, wasn't just laughing. Fowler was a predator, and predators don't like anomalies. Fowler wanted the Mercer land for its water rights, and he wanted it cheap. The fact that Harlan was attempting some bizarre secret crop made Fowler paranoid. What if Harlan actually grew something? What if he found a loophole to save his land? Fowler called in his foreman, a hulking, ruthless man named Boyd Tucker. "I don't know what Mercer buried out there in the ice," Fowler told Boyd over a glass of expensive bourbon. "But I'm not taking any chances. If he yields a crop, the bank won't foreclose. Make sure whatever is under that snow stays dead." Boyd nodded. He knew exactly what to do. On a moonless night in late February, the temperature hovering around 0, Boyd Tucker drove a flatbed truck to the back road bordering the Mercer property. In the back of the truck were 6 50-gallon barrels of industrial road salt and chemical defoliant, a highly concentrated herbicide designed to kill anything with roots. Boyd unloaded a heavy-duty snowmobile. He strapped a mechanical spreader to the back, loaded it with the toxic mixture, and tore out into the Mercer fields. For 2 hours, Boyd drove in wide, sweeping grids across the property. The machine roared through the night, the spreader violently throwing the chemical salt across the pristine snow. The weight of the snowmobile treads heavily compacted the snow, crushing the top layer into dense ice, while the chemicals settled on the surface, ready to seep down into the soil the moment the thaw began. When Harlan woke up the next morning and looked out his window, his heart stopped. The field was crisscrossed with deep, aggressive track marks. He threw on his boots and sprinted out to the fields. He fell to his knees in the snow, digging frantically with his bare hands. The snow smelled acrid metallic. He tasted a flake on his tongue and immediately spat it out. Salt poison. Abigail came running out behind him. "Harlan, what is it?" "Fowler." Harlan whispered, his voice cracking with despair. "He poisoned the field. The moment this snow melts, that chemical is going to wash directly into the topsoil. It's going to burn the bulbs alive." Harlan sat in the snow and wept. It was over. The bank deadline was 30 days away, and Fowler had just guaranteed his destruction. Harlan went back to the house, locked himself in his study, and didn't come out for 2 days. He began organizing the bankruptcy paperwork. Fowler had won, but Harlan didn't understand the miraculous biology of Dr. Gallagher's alpine saffron. 2 weeks later, the mid-March weather began to shift. The brutal freeze slowly gave way to a creeping, agonizing thaw. The temperature rose to 35 degrees, then 40. The snow began to turn to slush. Harlan stood on his back porch, watching the poisoned water melt into the earth, waiting for the inevitable stench of rotting bulbs. But something strange happened. Because Boyd Tucker had driven the heavy snowmobile over the fields in a grid pattern, he had compacted the snow violently. This created a dense, hyper-insulated layer of ice right above the soil. When the salt and chemicals hit the top layer, they caused the surface snow to melt rapidly, but the compacted ice barrier beneath acted like a shield. The toxic runoff didn't soak straight down. Instead, it washed laterally, following the grooves of the snowmobile tracks directly into the drainage ditches at the edge of the property. More incredibly, the extreme compaction and the sudden surface melting triggered an intense thermogenic reaction in the soil below. On the morning of March 24th, just 7 days before the bank's foreclosure deadline, Abigail woke up early to make coffee. She glanced out the kitchen window toward the fields, expecting to see the barren, ruined mud. She dropped her coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum floor. "Harlan!" She screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet house. "Harlan, get down here!" Harlan stumbled down the stairs, his heart racing, fearing a fire or an intruder. He ran into the kitchen and followed Abigail's trembling finger pointing out the window. Harlan stopped breathing. The snow had largely melted, leaving behind patches of dark, muddy earth. But the field wasn't dead. Pushing through the frost, bursting aggressively through the cold mud, were thousands upon thousands of vivid, bright green shoots. And resting at the top of these shoots, tightly wound and ready to explode, were deep, brilliant purple flowers. Against all odds, against the freezing temperatures, against the mockery of the town, and the sabotage of Garrett Fowler, the alpine saffron had survived. Harlan threw open the back door and ran into the mud in his bare feet. He fell to his knees, his hands shaking, as he gently touched one of the purple petals. It was real. As the morning sun crested over the horizon, the temperature hit 50 degrees. Like magic, the purple petals began to unfurl. Inside the flowers were 3 distinct, fiery, crimson threads, the stigmas, the red gold. By noon, the entire 300-acre field had erupted into a sea of breathtaking, impossible purple. It was a spectacle Oakhaven had never seen, but the battle wasn't over. Harlan had exactly 1 week to harvest millions of delicate threads by hand, process them, and find a buyer, all while Garrett Fowler sat in his mansion, realizing his sabotage had utterly failed. And Fowler wasn't the type of man to lose gracefully. The euphoria of the purple bloom lasted exactly 1 hour. Then the terrifying reality of the situation crashed down on Harlan Mercer. 300 acres of blooming crocus sativus, millions of individual flowers, each containing exactly 3 delicate red stigmas. Saffron could not be harvested by machine. The threads were too fragile. Every single flower had to be plucked by hand, and the stigmas carefully extracted with tweezers. Furthermore, the blossoms would only survive for about 4 days before wilting and taking the precious red gold down with them. Harlan and Abigail were just 2 people. To harvest 300 acres in 96 hours, they needed an army. Harlan drove his truck into Oakhaven at 70 miles an hour, skidding into the gravel parking lot of the local hardware store. He bought every pair of tweezers, every bucket, and every pair of knee pads they had. The townspeople stared at him, whispering. The news of the purple field had already spread like wildfire, but nobody knew exactly what it was. Some thought it was a weed. Others thought it was a toxic mutation caused by the blizzard. Harlan knew nobody in town would help him. Fowler practically owned the local workforce. But Abigail had a different idea. While Harlan was in town, Abigail picked up the phone and started calling the ghosts of Oakhaven. She called Tiago Dempsey, a 3rd-generation dairy farmer whose land Fowler had foreclosed on 2 years prior. She called Greg Harmon and William Cole, men who had been forced out of the agricultural business and into minimum-wage jobs at the county lumber yard because they couldn't compete with Fowler's corporate monopolies. Tiago, Abigail said over the phone, her voice steady and resolute. Harlan grew saffron. The whole field is blooming. We have 4 days to harvest it, or Fowler takes our land just like he took yours. We are offering $30 an hour cash, plus a 5% equity share of the final sale to anyone who helps us pick. Tiago Dempsey showed up at the Mercer farm an hour later. He didn't come alone. He brought his wife, his 3 teenage sons, Greg Harmon, William Cole, and 24 other displaced farmers and their families. A convoy of beat-up sedans and rusty pickup trucks lined the Mercer driveway. They weren't just there for the money. They were there for revenge. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 75 people were on their knees in the cold Dakota mud. It was grueling, agonizing labor. Backs screamed in protest, knees bruised against the frozen clumps of dirt, and fingers went numb in the biting 35-degree air. But the buckets began to fill. Thousands of purple flowers were carried into the Mercer barn, where Abigail had set up a processing line. Long wooden tables were lined with men and women painstakingly plucking the 3 crimson threads from each blossom. Next came the drying. Saffron is worthless wet. Dr. Gallagher had explicitly warned Harlan that the threads had to be flash-dried at precisely 140 degrees Fahrenheit to lock in the crocan, the chemical compound that gives the spice its color and value. Harlan had transformed the back half of the barn into a makeshift kiln running industrial space heaters and commercial dehumidifiers off massive diesel generators. The smell inside the barn was intoxicating, a rich, earthy, honey-like aroma that signaled pure, concentrated wealth As the weekend progressed, the harvest continued around the clock under halogen lights. 2 miles away, Garrett Fowler stood on the balcony of his custom-built estate, staring through a pair of high-powered hunting binoculars at the glowing Mercer farm. His face was purple with rage. The rumors had reached him. Saffron? The crazy bastard had actually grown the most expensive crop on Earth in the dead of winter. Fowler slammed his fist against the balcony railing. If Mercer successfully sold that crop, he wouldn't just save his farm, he would become a multimillionaire, utterly immune to Fowler's corporate bullying. Worse, he would prove that small-time farmers could outmaneuver the corporate conglomerates. Fowler called Boyd Tucker into his study. "I don't care what you have to do," Fowler snarled, pouring a drink with trembling hands. "The bank deadline is Wednesday morning. If he sells that harvest, I lose the water rights to the entire Southern Valley. I want that barn burned to the ground. Tonight." Boyd cracked his knuckles, a dark smirk crossing his face. "It's a wooden barn full of space heaters and diesel generators, Mr. Fowler. Accidents happen all the time when amateurs play with industrial equipment." It was Tuesday night, March 30th, 36 hours before the foreclosure deadline. Inside the Mercer barn, the harvest was complete. Sitting on the drying racks packed carefully into heavy glass mason jars was roughly 800 pounds of pure premium-grade alpine saffron. At current market rates, it was a fortune beyond comprehension. Harlan had sent the exhausted workers home with their cash wages, promising them their equity checks by the end of the week. The farm was eerily quiet. The wind had died down, leaving a thick, heavy silence over the property. At 2 a.m., a dark SUV rolled silently down the dirt road behind the Mercer property, its headlights extinguished. Boyd Tucker slipped out into the darkness, carrying 2 5-gallon plastic jugs of kerosene and a flare gun. He moved silently across the muddy field, keeping his profile low. He approached the back wall of the barn where the diesel generators were loudly humming, masking his footsteps. Boyd unscrewed the cap of the first kerosene jug and began splashing it against the dry, aged wood of the barn's foundation. He smiled to himself, imagining the inferno. He reached for the flare gun at his belt. Click! The sound of a pump-action shotgun, echoing in the quiet night, was unmistakable. "I wouldn't," a deep voice growled from the shadows. A blinding floodlight suddenly snapped on, pinning Boyd like a rat. Standing 10 feet away was Harlan Mercer, the 12-gauge leveled perfectly at Boyd's chest. But Harlan wasn't alone. Stepping out from behind the massive oak tree next to the barn was Mitchell Hayes, the county sheriff, holding his service weapon. "Drop the flare, Boyd," Sheriff Hayes commanded, his voice cold as ice. Harlan had known Fowler wouldn't sit idly by. Desperate men do desperate things, and Harlan had anticipated the sabotage. He had called Sheriff Hayes 3 days ago, explaining the previous snowmobile tracks and the defoliant. Hayes, who had grown up with Harlan and despised Fowler's arrogant reign over the town, had agreed to sit in the dark with Harlan every night until the deadline passed. Boyd dropped the flare gun, raising his hands. "Fowler made me do it," he stammered instantly, turning on his boss. "He paid me 10 grand to burn it down." "Turn around and put your hands on your head," Hayes said, stepping forward with handcuffs. "We'll see what a judge has to say about that." The next morning, the sun rose on April 1st. At 9 a.m. sharp, a sleek black Mercedes pulled into the Mercer driveway. Out stepped Dr. Elias Gallagher, followed by a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit, Philip Harrington, the chief procurement officer for one of the largest culinary syndicates in Europe. Harrington walked into the barn, setting a silver briefcase on the table. He opened a jar of the dried saffron, pulling out a jeweler's loupe and a pair of silver tongs. He examined the crimson threads, holding them up to the light. He then dropped a single thread into a glass of warm water. The water instantly exploded into a brilliant luminescent gold. Harrington looked up, his eyes wide. "The Crokin levels are spectacular," The cold shock. It trapped the volatile oils perfectly. I've been buying saffron from Iran and Spain for 30 years, and I have never seen a profile like this. Mr. Mercer, how much do you have? 812 pounds. Harlan said, his voice steady. Harrington didn't blink. He opened his briefcase. My syndicate will take all of it. We are prepared to offer you $5,000 a pound. That comes out to $4,060,000. Abigail let out a stifled sob, burying her face in Harlan's shoulder. At 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the noon foreclosure deadline, Bradley Higgins was sitting in his office at Midland Trust. Garrett Fowler was sitting across from him, grinning smugly, a cashier's check for the foreclosure auction already sitting on the desk. I told you, Bradley. Fowler laughed. He was a dead man walking. The heavy mahogany doors to the office swung open. Harlan Mercer walked in. He was still wearing his muddy boots and his worn Carhartt jacket. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a king. Harlan walked right past Fowler, ignoring him completely, and slapped a piece of paper onto the bank manager's desk. Bradley Higgins looked down. It was a certified wire transfer receipt from a major international bank. The amount was $4,060,000. The debt is cleared, Bradley. Harlan said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Draw up the release of the deed. I want it signed and notarized right now. Fowler shot out of his chair, his face pale. That's impossible. Where did you get that kind of money? This is a fraud. It's not fraud, Garrett, Harlan replied, finally turning to look at the corporate tyrant. It's farming. Something you wouldn't understand. Before Fowler could say another word, the doors opened again. Sheriff Mitchell Hayes walked in, his hand resting on his belt. Garrett Fowler, Hayes said, loudly echoing through the quiet bank. I have a warrant for your arrest for conspiracy to commit arson and agricultural sabotage. Put your hands behind your back. The town of Oakhaven watched through the bank windows as Garrett Fowler was marched out in handcuffs. The tyrant had fallen. Harlan walked out of the bank 10 minutes later, the clear deed to his family's land folded safely in his chest pocket. He looked out at the distant rolling hills of his farm. Next winter the snow would fall again. But they wouldn't call him crazy anymore. They would call him the man who turned ice into gold. If Harlan's incredible battle against the odds and corporate greed kept you on the edge of your seat, don't keep this triumph to yourself. Hit that like button to support real underdog stories. Share this video with a friend who needs some serious inspiration today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life tales of grit and survival. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Harlan's shoes? See you in the next one.